Welcome to the useless hour. Tonight we consider something that does not matter at all, and we are going to take our time about it. Tonight's subject is a traffic jam. Not a metaphorical one, not a jam standing in for something larger about modernity or the human condition, although it will be tempting later to let it stand in for those things. Tonight, we are simply going to consider a queue of stationary vehicles on a road in northern China in the summer of 2010, how it formed, how long it lasted, what the people inside it ate, and why the road it happened on was, in a sense, always going to produce it. It is generally held to be the longest traffic jam in recorded history. It was around 100 kilometers long. It lasted 11 or 12 days, depending on who was counting, and we will come to why even that is uncertain. Nothing about it changed the course of anything. You do not need to remember any of this. But before the jam, the road. We will spend a while on the road. It deserves it, and you are not going anywhere. China National Highway 110 begins in Beijing. It is one of the long national trunk roads that radiate out from the capital like spokes, numbered in a system where the second digit tells you roughly which direction you are being sent, and 110 is sent northwest. It runs, in its classic definition, 1,357 kilometers from Beijing to Yinchuan in Ningxia, out where the Yellow River makes its great northern loop. Along the way, it touches Zhangjiakou at the 218th kilometer, Ho Hot at the 564th, Baotou at the 747th, Linhai at around the 1010th, then Yinchuan and the end of the number. Later, the route was extended a little further to Qingtongsha because roads are rarely allowed to simply finish. Running beside it, sometimes almost alongside it, sometimes crossing it, sometimes swallowing its traffic entirely, is the newer thing, the expressway. The G6, the Beijing-Lhasa Expressway, known in Chinese as the Jingzhang, Beijing to Tibet. It is one of the great ambitious lines on the Chinese roadmap, intended eventually to reach Lhasa itself, thousands of kilometers away across the Tibetan plateau, and in 2010 it existed in the usual condition of such projects, complete and magnificent in parts, unfinished in others, under repair in still others. The two roads, the old national highway and the new expressway, share the same corridor out of Beijing because the corridor is not negotiable. This is the part worth dwelling on. Beijing sits at the northern edge of the North China Plain, which is very flat and very large and full of people. To its northwest, the land stops being flat with some abruptness. The Taihang Range comes up from the southwest and hands the job over to the Yanshan Mountains, which run away to the northeast, and where the two meet there is a knot of hills and narrow valleys that has been the strategic hinge of northern China for as long as anyone has been writing things down. This is why the Great Wall is there. The wall is not decorative in that region. It is drawn along the tops of those ridges, precisely because the ridges are the wall already, and the wall merely finishes the argument. Which means that if you want to go northwest out of Beijing, towards Zhangjiakou, towards the grasslands, towards Inner Mongolia and the coal fields, and eventually Mongolia proper, you do not have very many choices about where. You go up through the gap. The gap is the Guanggu Valley, the long defile that climbs to the Juyong Pass and then to Badaling, roughly 70 kilometers northwest of the city, where the Great Wall crosses overhead in the photograph everyone has seen. The road threads underneath and through it. It has always been the gate. The old caravan traffic went that way. The Beijing-Zhangjiakou Railway, engineered by John Tianyu and opened in 1909, went that way too, and had to resort to a switchback zigzag at Qinglongchao. The train pulls forward, stops, and reverses up the next leg, because the grade could not be beaten honestly. When the railway of 1909 has to fold itself in half to get out of Beijing, you may take it as a hint about the terrain.
So the road climbs from Beijing at something like 40 or 50 meters above sea level, up through the passes, out into the Wailai Basin with the Guanting Reservoir sitting pale in the middle of it, on through Xuanhua and into Zhangjiakou at around 700 meters, the town the old maps and the old traders called Kalgan, itself named for a gate in the wall, the place where the tea went north and the horses came south. And then it climbs again, up the escarpment onto the Mongolian plateau, where Ulaanbaatar and Jining sit at something like 1,400 meters in a landscape that has stopped pretending to be hilly and has become simply high, wide, dry, and cold-tempered. The sky enormous, the horizon a straight grey line. In the space of a few hundred kilometers, the road has left one country and arrived in another that happens to be the same country. Consider the road now as a physical object, because it is one, and because objects are restful to think about.
Grey concrete and black asphalt in long, unequal panels. Expressway sections with a hard shoulder, a metal crash barrier, a central reservation, and in the good stretches, 2 or 3 lanes running each way, enough that a lorry can, in theory, be overtaken. The old national highway is thinner, often a single lane in each direction, edged with poplar trees planted in ranks as windbreaks, running through villages where the buildings come right up to the tarmac, and the tarmac is dusted permanently pale. There are the gradients that mean nothing in a car and everything in a fully loaded articulated truck. Long, patient climbs of several kilometers where a heavy vehicle drops into low gear and settles to a crawl, and the queue behind it accordions gently. And then the descent, where brakes get hot and the smell of them hangs over the carriageway in the still air. There are the toll gates, concrete islands under a wide canopy, a row of booths with lit numbers above them, a barrier arm, an attendant, a moment of stopping. Every truck must stop. Every truck must be dealt with individually and then accelerate away from rest, all those tons coming up to speed one after another, which is a thing worth filing away for later when we come to the physics of why traffic behaves as it does. And there is the repair. The corridor was, in that era, almost continuously under repair somewhere along its length, and for a straightforward reason. The traffic on it was heavier and more numerous than the surface had been specified to carry, and heavy freight does not wear a road gradually so much as it consumes it. Asphalt, under repeated axle loads in summer heat, begins to rut and shove. The wheel tracks sink, the edges lift. So the crews come and cone off a lane and mill up the surface and lay new material, and while they do it, the road is briefly half of itself. Roadworks on a route with slack in it are an inconvenience. Roadworks on a route with no slack in it are something else. Because that is the last thing to establish about this road, and it is the whole point. The geography we have just walked through, the mountains, the single gap, the pass, the climb, funnels an enormous quantity of freight into a very small number of lanes. What comes down off that plateau towards Beijing and the coast does not have many alternatives. The railway was built through the same gap for the same reason and has its own limits. There is no third way round. Everything must come through the eye of the needle, and the eye does not widen no matter how much you ask it to. There is no test on any of this. It will not help you. But hold it in your mind for a moment as a picture. A summer evening in the middle of August, the light going orange and dusty over the plateau. The poplars along the verge quite still. The tarmac still radiating the day's heat. The toll booths lit up. A lane coned off somewhere ahead for resurfacing that has not yet begun in earnest. And the road running down off the high ground towards the passes and the capital beyond, open, waiting, and, for the moment, almost empty. And then, from the west, the sound of engines. What arrives on it is coal. Not exclusively coal, and not coal alone, but overwhelmingly and relentlessly coal, moving in one direction from the dry uplands of Inner Mongolia towards the furnaces and boilers and power stations of Beijing and the coastal plain beyond it. To understand why 100 kilometers of road could fill and stay filled for the better part of a fortnight, you have to understand that this corridor was not really a road in the ordinary sense by the summer of 2010. It had become a conveyor belt, an improvised pipeline made of rubber and diesel and steel, carrying a black mineral out of the ground in one province and delivering it ton by ton to the appetite of another. The appetite is the place to begin. China, in 2010, drew something in the order of 70% of its primary energy from coal, a proportion that had held remarkably steady even as the economy underneath it multiplied. Power stations burned it, steelworks burned it, cement kilns burned it. Households in the north burned it directly through winters that arrive early and stay. And the capital, sitting where it sits at the edge of the North China Plain with mountains at its back, consumed a great deal of it and produced almost none, which meant that every kilowatt of it had to come from somewhere else and had to cross a landscape to get there. For the most of the modern era, somewhere else meant Shanxi. Shanxi was the coal province, the one whose name was almost a synonym for the substance, whose hills were tunneled through and hollowed out, and whose small private pits multiplied through the boom years with a speed that outran any inspector's ability to follow them. They were also, with grim regularity, lethal. Official figures for deaths in China's coal mines ran into the thousands annually in that period, and the true number was widely assumed to be higher, because a small illegal pit that kills 4 men has every incentive not to mention it. From around 2008 and through 2009, the provincial authorities in Shanxi undertook a forced consolidation, pushing thousands of small private mines into the arms of large, mostly state-owned companies, closing many outright. The consolidation did what consolidations tend to do. It reduced supply from Shanxi without reducing demand anywhere at all, and the demand, being demand, went looking north instead. It found Inner Mongolia. The Ordos Basin in the Great Loop of the Yellow River holds one of the largest and most accessible coal endowments on the planet. The confirmed reserves of Ordos municipality alone are usually given as something over 200 billion tons, roughly a sixth of China's proven total and about half of Inner Mongolia's. Much of it lies shallow enough to be taken by open-cast mining, which is to say, by simply removing the landscape above it, which is cheaper and faster and requires fewer men underground than the tunneled seams further south. Through the late 2000s, output there rose at a rate that is difficult to hold in the mind. By the end of 2010, the region had passed Shanxi outright to become the largest coal-producing region in the country, and it has never given the title back. The figure most often repeated in accounts of the traffic jam is that something in the region of 600 million tons was mined and moved in 2009, with expectations of well over 700 million for 2010. Ordos itself became, briefly, one of the wealthiest cities per head in China, reporting at the time that its per capita output had overtaken Hong Kong's, and it spent the money on a new district of broad boulevards and civic architecture that stood, famously, almost entirely empty. But the coal did not stay in Ordos. The coal had to travel about 600 kilometers to be useful. The obvious way to move 600 million tons of anything is by rail, and China had built, for exactly this purpose, one of the most extraordinary freight railways ever constructed. The Da-Chin to Qinhuangdao line, the Da-Chin, runs from the coal fields to the great coal port on the Bohai Sea, and it carries more coal than any other railway line in China, which is to say, more coal than any other railway line in the world. It was designed to move 100 million tons a year. It reached that figure after about a decade. Then it was upgraded and upgraded again with longer trains and heavier axle loads and tighter headways, until by 2009 it was moving something close to 330 million tons, and in 2010 around 400 million. That is the crucial fact, and it is worth pausing on because it is the hinge on which the whole story turns. The railway was not neglected. The railway was not inadequate through carelessness. The railway was quadrupled, and it was still full. Every path on it was allocated, every wagon spoken for, every slot bid over by producers who could not get their tonnage on. And coal that cannot get on a train in a market where the coal is already sold and the buyer is already waiting does not wait politely at the mine gate for the timetable to improve. It gets on a lorry. You do not need to remember any of this. It is only the arithmetic that put 10,000 trucks in a line. So the trucks came, thousands of them, tens of thousands over a season, and they came down a very small number of viable roads because the country between the Ordos Basin and Beijing is not obliging terrain. It rises and falls and narrows, and the corridor northwest of the capital through Hebei funnels everything into a handful of usable throats. The G110 and the Beijing Tibet Expressway running beside it were among the few. This was not a network with graceful alternatives. It was a road with a road next to it. The trucks themselves deserve description because they are the actual instrument of what happened. They were, very often, overloaded, not marginally, not by the odd inconvenient ton, but routinely and structurally, far beyond the legal axle limits, in a way that was completely understood by everybody involved, and enforced only intermittently. The reason is not mysterious, and requires no villainy to explain. Haulage was paid by weight. The driver's costs, diesel, tolls, maintenance, the loan on the vehicle, were very largely fixed per journey, while his revenue rose with every additional ton he could persuade onto the bed. A great many of these drivers were owner-operators, single men with a single truck, often financed, working on margins thin enough that the difference between a good month and a ruinous one lay in exactly that extra load. Overloading was not an abuse of the system. Overloading was the system's own logic, followed faithfully. And here the loop closes. quietly and perfectly. Road engineers have understood since the great American road tests of the late 1950s that pavement damage does not rise in proportion to axle weight. It rises with something like the fourth power of it. Double the load on an axle and you do not double the harm. You do something closer to 16 times the harm. A road designed for a certain traffic mix, subjected instead to a continuous procession of vehicles carrying half again what they should, does not wear out gradually. It fails, it ruts, it cracks, the surface breaks up under the wheel paths, and it requires resurfacing far sooner and far more often than any planner budgeted for. Resurfacing requires closing lanes. Closing lanes reduces capacity. On the G110 corridor that summer, maintenance works were underway that halved the available road, with a program scheduled to run into the middle of September. Traffic on the route had reportedly been growing at around 40% a year, and at its worst, the volume was running something like 60% above what the road had been designed to carry. So the trucks whose overloading had destroyed the road were now queuing on a road halved in width in order to repair the damage the overloading had done, which slowed the trucks, which concentrated more of them into the same stretch at the same time, which is precisely the condition under which a road stops flowing at all. There is one further thread, and it is the least respectable one. A portion of this coal was mined without proper license, or moved without proper paperwork, or both. There existed on the neighboring National Highway 208 a coal quality supervision and inspection station, a checkpoint of the sort that weighs, inspects, documents, and, if all is not in order, detains. Drivers told the Beijing News in reporting from those weeks that they took the G110 for a straightforward reason. There were no coal checkpoints on it, and therefore no inspectors to be paid to look elsewhere. A checkpoint on one road is functionally a magnet on the road beside it. The date most often given is the 14th of August 2010, though it would be more honest to say that nobody can point to a moment when the road was moving and then a moment when it was not. Traffic jams do not begin the way battles begin. There is no first shot, no crossing of a river. There is only a gradual thickening, a slow loss of gaps. A road that was merely busy on the Thursday and was something else entirely by the Saturday. The 14th is the date that entered the record, and the record has kept it, and so we will keep it too, with the quiet understanding that the road itself did not observe it. What had changed on the ground was small and administrative. Maintenance work had begun on China National Highway 110, the older road, the two-lane artery running northwest out of Beijing through Hebei and on into Inner Mongolia. The work was scheduled and routine and intended, in the ordinary way of such things, to make the road better. Reports at the time suggested it reduced the available capacity along the affected stretches by roughly half. The trucks that would otherwise have used the old road moved across onto the newer Beijing Tibet Expressway, the G6, which was already carrying more than it had been designed to imagine. And so a repair intended to relieve a road became, for 11 or 12 days, the reason the road stopped. The queue did not disperse. This is the part that is difficult to hold in the mind. A traffic jam, in ordinary experience, is a thing that resolves. You sit in it, you inch, you are released, and you forget it. This one did not resolve. It grew. Vehicles joined the back of it faster than vehicles left the front of it, which is the entire mechanism stated plainly, and which is also the entire mechanism by which a snowdrift becomes a glacier. Each hour, the tail of the queue moved further back down the road toward Beijing, not because anyone was traveling backwards, but because the definition of where the jam started kept being revised in the direction of the capital.
By the third week of August, the reported length had reached about 100 kilometres. Some accounts gave 120, or 74.5 miles, which is the figure that circulated in the American press and which sounds more precise than it can possibly have been. The longest stretch, most often named, runs between Huai'an in Hebei province and Jining in Inner Mongolia, though other accounts placed the worst of it further west still, between Jining and the Dongsheng district of Ordos, out where the coal comes from. These are not the same stretch of road. They overlap. They are not identical. It is worth sitting with the fact that the longest traffic jam in recorded history has no agreed location, only a general region in the way that a weather system has a general region.
The speed is the detail that people remember, and it deserves to be said slowly. Vehicles were reported to be moving approximately 1 kilometre in a day, not 1 kilometre an hour, 1 kilometre between one sunrise and the next. Some reports gave figures worse than that. An official at the Traffic Management Bureau of Zhangjiakou City, the Hebei city that sits along this corridor, was quoted describing progress at one point as little more than half a mile a day. At that rate, a driver at the back of the queue, if the queue were merely 100 kilometers of stationary metal and nothing more were added to it, would require something on the order of 3 months to reach the front. Drivers spoke of having been in it for 5 days without any clear sense of having gone anywhere. A person walking at an unhurried pace could have covered the whole length of it in about a day. Several people did walk parts of it, which we will come to later. There is no good word for the pace of that thing. It is too slow to be called traffic. It behaved less like a flow of vehicles and more like a landform, a scree slope, a mud flow, something that advances by centimeters and is measured after the fact by where it ended up. The trucks were not traveling. They were being deposited. The response was substantial, and it was also, for a very long time, ineffective, which are two things that can be true at once. Traffic police were deployed along the corridor to direct vehicles and to break the mass into something that could be managed. Vehicles were released forward in stages rather than all at once, on the reasonable principle that letting everyone move simultaneously simply reproduces the jam a few hundred meters further on. Trucking companies were asked to suspend departures altogether or to send their drivers by other routes. Entry to the affected stretches was restricted. In Beijing, the rules governing when heavy goods vehicles could enter the city were loosened, particularly at night, so that the front of the queue might drain a little faster into the capital rather than backing up against it. And truckers were directed onto a detour reported at around 180 miles, which is a very long way to send a man carrying coal in order to save him from a road he can see. Somewhere around the 25th and 26th of August, it eased. The accounts differ here as well. Some say the road cleared over the weekend. Some say it dissipated by the 26th. The Chinese press, reporting a few days later, described the August event as having lasted 9 days, while agency reports at the time said around 10, and headlines abroad said 11, and the number that has settled into common memory is 12. Officials were not universally comfortable with the framing being applied from outside. There were suggestions from within the relevant bureaus that the situation had been improving for some time before the foreign coverage peaked, and the 100-kilometre figure and the 11 or 12-day figure described the outer edge of a thing whose interior was rather more mobile than it looked. Both accounts can be partly right. Where a queue begins and ends is a matter of definition, and definitions were the one commodity in genuinely short supply. What should be said, and said calmly, is that this was not a singular event. It was the worst instance of an ongoing condition. State media noted at the time that drivers on this corridor had become accustomed to delays of this order, and referred to a similar jam in July of the same year, which had slowed traffic for close to a month. A month? Nobody wrote about that one. It did not have a number attached to it that travelled well. Nor did the August jam end the pattern. On Saturday the 28th of August, 4 days after the Great Queue had been declared dispersed, the Beijing-Tibet highway jammed again near Zhangjiakou and extending toward Inner Mongolia, this time for something around 30 kilometres, 18 miles, roughly a third of the size of its predecessor. State media attributed it to an accident and to road maintenance. At least one truck driver, a man named Lu Yong, was caught in both of them in nearly the same place within a week. By early September, the reported congestion between Ordos and Jining had reached about 120 kilometers and was being described as having run for more than 20 days on and off, the maintenance work not being due for completion until the middle of that month. A professor of transport at Beijing Jiaotong University was asked what could be done and offered the view that there was no short-term solution available. So the 12 days of August were not a rupture in the ordinary functioning of that road. They were the ordinary functioning of that road held up to the light and photographed. The queue formed, the queue extended itself westward and eastward at once, the queue was managed and staged and diverted and pleaded with, and eventually the queue thinned and was gone, and then it came back, smaller, and then larger, and then smaller again, the way a tide comes back, without malice and without any particular urgency about it. A truck cab is a small room. It is roughly the size of a garden shed laid on its side, and it contains a seat, a bunk if the driver is fortunate, a windscreen, and a certain amount of accumulated life, a thermos, a folded quilt, a plastic basin, photographs held on with tape. For most of a working year, that room moves. For 11 or 12 days in August of 2010, on a stretch of road running down out of Inner Mongolia and into Hebei, several thousand of those small rooms did not move, or moved so little that the difference was hard to measure. And the men inside them went on living in them anyway, because there was nowhere else to go. The Guardian's Asia environment correspondent, Jonathan Watts, drove out to see it and arrived at 2 o'clock in the morning. What he described was not chaos. It was 3 lanes of lorries, bumper to bumper, stretching past the limit of what he could see, with the engines switched off and the lights switched off, and the drivers asleep in their cabins. That is the detail that undoes most people's expectation of the thing. A traffic jam in the imagination is loud. It has horns in it. This one at night was quiet. 100 kilometers of parked vehicles with their diesel engines cooled, holding coal, holding building materials, holding whatever Beijing had ordered that week, while the men who drove them slept. They slept in the cabs, and reports from the time describe drivers sleeping underneath the trucks as well, in the shade the chassis threw, which in August in that part of northern China is not a small consideration. It is a dry, continental heat there in late summer, and a metal box with the engine off has no air conditioning, because air conditioning requires the engine, and the engine requires diesel, and diesel is the one thing a driver stuck indefinitely on a road with no fuel station has strong reasons not to waste. So the choice on the hot afternoons was between a stifling cab and the gravel underneath it. Many chose the gravel. Into this, from the villages either side of the road, came the vendors. They came on foot, and they came on bicycles, and the contemporary accounts are consistent about this. Local people wove between the stopped lorries with instant noodles, with bottled water, with cigarettes, with boxed lunches and small snacks, and they sold them at prices that reflected, with total honesty, what the situation actually was. A bottle of water that would ordinarily cost 1 yuan was reported selling on the highway for 10, and in some accounts for 15. Instant noodles, drivers complained, had more than tripled. One driver told reporters he was being asked 4 times the usual price while he waited in the congestion. Some of the sellers set themselves up as mobile shops on their bicycles and worked the line the way a vendor works a stadium. Exactly what else was on offer varies from telling to telling, and the further from 2010 an account was written, the longer the list of goods tends to become, which is its own quiet lesson about how stories travel. It is tempting to reach for a word like exploitation, and the drivers at the time certainly reached for harder words than that. But consider it from the other side of the transaction for a moment, without hurry. A village sits beside a road. For years the road is a thing that passes. It brings dust and noise and nothing else. And then one August the road stops, and for a week and a half there are several thousand men on your doorstep with money in their pockets and no alternative supplier within any reasonable distance, and you own a bicycle and a case of noodles. What happened on Highway 110 is simply what economics says will happen when demand cannot walk away. It required no conspiracy. It required a road, a shortage, and a bicycle. And the arithmetic of the men buying was worse than the price tag suggested. A long-haul driver on that route was not being paid by the hour. He was paid broadly for the delivery, for the load arriving, which means that every day spent stationary earned him nothing at all, while costing him everything he ate. Fuel had already been bought, the load had already been paid for. Whatever thin margin the trip was meant to produce was being eaten, one 15-yuan bottle of water at a time, by the fact of not moving. Some drivers, according to Xinhua, had been stuck for 3 days and 2 nights when they were interviewed. Others reported 5 days. The vehicles at the worst of it were managing something in the order of 1 kilometre in a day. A man could sit for a week watching his own profit be consumed by his own thirst, and there was no decision available to him that would change it. He could not turn round. On a 3-lane road packed solid with lorries, there is no turning round. That is the particular cruelty of a jam of that scale. It removes not just movement, but the entire category of choice. So they played cards. The reporting from those days mentions it again and again. Cards and chess, set up in the gaps between the trailers, on the tarmac, on upturned crates, in whatever shade could be found. Men walked. They walked the length of a few dozen trucks and back for no reason other than to have gone somewhere. They slept in the afternoons, which is what boredom does to a body that has nothing to push against. What the record is thin on, and it is better to say so plainly than to invent it, is the practical business of sanitation. The contemporary wire reports simply do not dwell on it, And the honest answer is that on 100 kilometres of highway with no services, several thousand people walked off the shoulder and into the verge and the fields beyond, and nobody wrote it down. Here is the thing about it that is most quietly remarkable. In an ordinary traffic jam, the people around you are strangers who are also temporary. The car beside you at the lights is a car you will never see again, and you behave accordingly. But when the queue does not move for a week, your neighbors stop being traffic and become neighbors. The man in front of you on Sunday is the man in front of you on Thursday. You learn what he hauls and where he is from and how he takes his tea. You learn that he snores. 100-kilometre line of stationary lorries is, functionally, a very long and very thin village, one truck wide, with a population in the thousands, and a main street of tarmac. And villages generate rules, whether anyone asks them to or not. And so they did. Someone would walk the line for water, while someone else watched both cabs. A place in the queue could be held informally and without any authority whatsoever, because the alternative, every man for himself, in a line that could not move anyway, served nobody. Later retellings mention theft along the line at night, and one widely repeated account describes a driver injured. The contemporary reporting from the major outlets does not confirm it, and it is better not to claim more certainty than exists. But the fear of it, real or rumored, would have been enough on its own to make the arrangement matter. In a linear settlement with no police station and no doors, the only security available is the man parked behind you agreeing to notice things. You do not need to remember any of this. What is worth holding on to as the road cools and the engines stay off is how ordinary it must have felt from the inside. Nobody in that queue knew they were in the longest traffic jam in recorded human history. Nobody looked up from a hand of cards and thought, this is going in the books. The world record was a thing assembled afterwards from above by people with maps and calculators and no stake in the outcome. From inside a cab on the 14th of August, it was simply a bad delay. From inside the same cab on the 15th, it was a worse delay that you had already begun to organize around. You knew where the noodle man came from now. You knew when the shade arrived. You knew which neighbor would wake you if the line shifted. It was not history. It was Tuesday, and then it was Wednesday. And then, with the terrible gentleness of the human capacity to normalize almost anything, it was simply where you lived. Somewhere underneath all of this, underneath the cold, the queue, the card games, and the endless flat road, there is a body of science, and it is stranger and more elegant than you might expect. Traffic has its own physics. It has equations and named waves and experiments conducted on closed tracks by serious people with stopwatches. It is a real field, studied in real universities, published in real journals of physics. And once you know a little of it, a traffic jam stops looking like a failure of manners and starts looking like weather. Begin with the oddest thing traffic does. On a motorway, on an ordinary afternoon with no accident, no roadworks, no lane closure, no police car, no fallen load, no reason of any kind, traffic can simply stop. Drivers crawl for 2 or 3 minutes, sometimes 10, and then, without ever passing anything, they accelerate away into open road. Nobody ever finds out what happened. There was nothing to find. Traffic scientists call this a phantom traffic jam, or more formally, a jam without a bottleneck. And it is not a rumor or a driver's superstition. It is a documented, reproducible physical phenomenon. Here is how it happens. One driver, for no reason at all, lifts off the accelerator slightly. Perhaps she glances at a road sign. Perhaps she has judged the gap ahead a little tight. She slows by 2 or 3 miles an hour. The driver behind her, who cannot see inside her head and only sees her car growing marginally larger in his windscreen, brakes, and here is the crucial thing, he brakes slightly harder than she did, not from panic, from prudence. He does not know how much she slowed, so he leaves himself margin. The driver behind him does the same, with a little more margin still, because he began from a smaller gap, and the driver behind him, and behind him. Each act of caution is individually reasonable. Each is a small overcorrection, and somewhere between 15 and 40 cars back, someone comes to a complete stop on a clear road for a reason that no longer exists and that nobody in that queue will ever learn. Now watch what the disturbance itself does, because this is the beautiful part. The cars are all traveling forwards, the jam is traveling backwards. The point at which drivers must brake creeps steadily upstream against the direction of travel, as new cars arrive at its rear and old cars escape from its front. It moves at a fairly reliable speed. Measurements on real motorways put it somewhere around 15 to 20 kilometers an hour, which is roughly a brisk cycling pace. The jam is not made of any particular cars. Its membership is changing constantly. It is a pattern moving through a medium, in the same way that a wave crossing a lake is not made of any particular water. You have almost certainly driven through one and felt nothing but irritation. You were passing through a wave. In 2008, a group of Japanese researchers, led by Yuki Sugiyama, then at Nagoya University, decided to make one on purpose. They published the result in the New Journal of Physics under the title Traffic Jams Without Bottlenecks: Experimental Evidence for the Physical Mechanism of the Formation of a Jam. The experiment was almost childishly simple. They took a circular track 230 meters around. They placed cars on it, evenly spaced, nose to tail in a single file. They asked the drivers to do one thing: drive at 30 kilometers an hour and keep a safe distance from the car in front. That was all. No obstacles, no signals, no merging. A perfect circle of road and a single gentle instruction. With a small number of cars, the ring rotated smoothly, more or less forever. But when the researchers put 22 cars on that 230 meters, something happened, and it happened quickly. Human beings cannot hold a speed exactly. Tiny differences appeared in the spacing. The differences amplified, and within less than a minute, on a closed loop with nothing whatsoever in the way, a cluster of stopped cars had formed at one point on the circle, and that cluster then began to travel slowly backwards around the ring, while every car in it continued to drive forwards. They had grown a traffic jam in a laboratory from nothing but drivers doing their best. You do not need to remember any of this. There is no test. The mathematics arrived long before the experiment. In 1955, Michael Lighthill and Gerald Witham published a paper on kinematic waves in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, and in 1956, Paul Richards published a closely related paper called Shock Waves on the Highway. Between them, they proposed something that still underpins the field: treat traffic not as a collection of individual vehicles at all, but as a fluid, a compressible one. Do not track the cars, track the density, how many vehicles occupy a stretch of road, and the flow, and let them behave the way a gas behaves in a pipe. It is called the Lighthill-Witham-Richards model, and its central insight is that a fluid is compressible. Disturbances in it can steepen into shocks. The abrupt wall of brake lights you meet on a motorway is, mathematically, a shock wave. It is the same species of object as the bang from a supersonic aircraft, only slower and made of voxels. Later work gave these waves a name of their own. In 2009, in Physical Review E, a group of mathematicians and engineers, Maurice Flynn, Aslan Kasimov, Jean-Christophe Nave, Rodolfo Rosales, and Benjamin Siebold, described self-sustained traveling waves in traffic flow, and, borrowing from the physics of detonation waves in gases, called them jammatons. The word is a small joke about salitons, but the phenomenon is entirely serious. A jammaton is a stop-and-go wave that sustains itself, drawing its energy from the flow it moves through, so that once formed, it does not simply fade away. It persists. It travels. It is, in a real and unsentimental sense, a thing. Underneath all of it sits a single relationship that traffic engineers draw on a page and call the fundamental diagram, first sketched by Bruce Greenshields in 1935 from photographs of Ohio traffic. It relates three quantities: how densely packed the cars are, how fast they are going, and how many of them get past a given point each hour. And it contains a result that feels wrong the first time you meet it.
A road does not carry the most vehicles when it is full. An empty road carries almost nobody because there is nobody on it. A completely packed road also carries almost nobody because nothing is moving. The maximum throughput, the greatest number of vehicles per hour a lane can actually deliver, occurs at an intermediate density, with the cars moving fairly briskly and comfortably spaced. Push past that critical density and throughput does not level off, it collapses. Adding cars beyond that point removes capacity. The road becomes worse at being a road. And once it collapses, it does not simply spring back. This is the property that matters most for anything you have heard so far tonight. A jam forms fast at the speed of a shock wave, and it dissolves slowly at the speed of one driver noticing a gap, deciding to move and accelerating, followed by the next, each with a reaction time of a second or so, propagating forwards through hundreds of vehicles. The queue builds at the speed of fear and empties at the speed of patience. This asymmetry is the whole reason that a delay of 10 minutes can produce an hour of congestion, and why a road that has broken down often discharges fewer vehicles per hour afterwards than it managed before it broke. There is one final result, and it is the one that most offends common sense. In 1968, the German mathematician Dietrich Brass published a paper on a paradox in traffic planning. He showed that in a network of roads where every driver independently chooses the fastest route for themselves, adding a new road, a shortcut, a connector, extra capacity, a gift, can make every single person's journey slower. Not some people, everyone. The new road is individually tempting, so everybody takes it, and the resulting redistribution is worse than the arrangement it replaced. The corollary has been observed in the field. Cities, including Seoul and New York, have, at various points, removed or closed major roads and found traffic improving rather than collapsing. Which brings us gently back to Highway 110 and to an important honesty. The jam that formed northwest of Beijing in August 2010 was not a phantom jam. It had a cause, and the cause was legible, and we have already laid it out in some detail. Coal, volume, and roadworks on a road being asked to carry far more than it was built for. Nobody needed a physicist to explain why it began. But why it took so long to end, that is pure Light Hill and Whittam. That is the fundamental diagram past its critical density on a road with nowhere to overflow to. The jam formed as a shock and drained as a trickle, and every hour of it obeyed the same quiet arithmetic that governs a laboratory ring of 22 cars in Nagoya and the 4 o'clock slowdown on a motorway where nothing at all is wrong. There is a habit among people who study these things of speaking about the China National Highway 110 jam as though it were a mountain, the tallest of its kind, and of measuring everything else against its slopes. That habit is understandable. It is also a little unfair to the rest of the field, which is populated by jams of real seriousness and real duration, some of them older, some of them stranger, and at least one of which still holds the only formal record anybody has ever bothered to award.
That record belongs to France. On the 16th of February 1980, on the autoroute network running northwards from Lyon in the direction of Paris, traffic came to a halt and stayed halted along a length usually given as 176 kilometres, which is to say 109 miles. Guinness World Records lists it to this day as the longest traffic jam by distance. The cause generally attributed to it is the most ordinary cause imaginable, a combination of weather and the calendar. It was the tail end of the winter school holidays, and the ski resorts of the Alps were emptying themselves back towards the capital all on the same weekend, and the weather turned, and there were accidents, and the road, already carrying more than it was built to carry, simply stopped. There is something almost tender about the fact that the longest jam Europe has ever recorded was made of families going home from the snow. It is worth pausing on what a record like that actually is. No instrument measured those 176 kilometers. There is no international authority for traffic jams, no body that sends inspectors with wheels and chains, no standard defining where a jam begins or at what speed a queue of cars stops being slow traffic and becomes a jam proper. The figures we have come from police reports, from radio bulletins, from gendarmes on motorcycles reporting back what they could see, and from helicopters that flew the length of it and estimated. Every number in this field arrived that way. This is precisely why the numbers wander from telling to telling, why the same jam is 176 kilometers in one account and 180 in another, and why anyone who tells you a jam was of a certain exact length is repeating an estimate that was made quickly, from the air, by someone who wanted to go home. The same record book carries a second entry for the east-west German border on the 12th of April 1990, with a figure of 18 million cars said to be crawling bumper to bumper. That number should be held loosely. Nobody counted 18 million cars. What is beyond dispute is the phenomenon underneath it, which began in the November of 1989, when the crossings opened and the Trabants came west. At Bornholmer Strasse, the first crossing to give way on the night of the 9th, and at Helmstedt and Marienborn on the road towards Hanover, the queues of small two-stroke cars ran back into the dark further than anyone could see the end of. People waited many hours to move a few hundred meters. On the western side, strangers stood along the roadside handing bananas and oranges through the windows of cars that were barely moving, and every citizen of the German Democratic Republic who crossed was given 100 Deutsche Marks of welcome money. It is the only traffic jam in this survey that people were glad to be in. 20 years before that, in the August of 1969, a dairy farm near Bethel in New York State absorbed a crowd nobody had planned for, and the roads of Sullivan County absorbed the crowd's cars. The New York Daily News reported that the drive from New York City to the festival site, a distance of rather less than 100 miles, was taking as long as 8 hours. From the stage, Arlo Guthrie announced that the New York State Thruway was closed, and the line has outlived almost everything else said that weekend. The Thruway was not closed. The police had closed at least one exit to stop feeding cars into a county that could not hold them, and that seems to have been enough for the rumor to make the rest of the journey by itself. Sao Paulo belongs in the survey too, though it belongs differently. The city's traffic engineering company measures congestion by adding together every queue in the city at a given moment, which produces a single number that describes no single jam. By that method, the evening of the 23rd of May 2014 produced 344 kilometres of accumulated queue across the metropolitan area, breaking a mark of 309 kilometres set the previous November. There was rain that day, and a bus strike, and 11 million people trying to get home at once. It is a sum rather than a line, and it should not be compared directly with the French figure, though it very often is. Moscow's contribution came at the very end of November 2012, when the heaviest snowfall the city had seen in half a century closed over the M10, the old highway between Moscow and St. Petersburg. Cars began piling up on the Friday night. By Sunday afternoon, the queue was reported at around 200 kilometres, and drivers, mostly lorry drivers, had been sitting in it for 3 days, without fuel, without food, without anywhere to go. A deputy prime minister put the figure at some 4,000 lorries and 5,000 other vehicles. The de-icing agents had not gone down in time. That was the whole of it. Bangkok has no single famous jam and does not need one, having spent the greater part of the 1990s as the city most often named the worst congested on Earth. The usual explanation given is structural. Only around 8% of Bangkok's surface area is road, against 20 or 30% in Western cities, and car ownership rose through the boom years far faster than anywhere to put the cars. The most frequently repeated fact about Bangkok traffic is that the city's traffic police maintained officers trained in basic midwifery for deliveries that would not reach a hospital in time. It is repeated so often because it is true and because it says the thing more efficiently than any statistic. Then there are the movements that are not accidents at all. Every year, China performs the largest recurring human migration on the planet, the 40-day spring festival travel season known as Chunyun, which in recent years has recorded something over 9 billion interregional passenger trips. The autumn Golden Week does something similar on a shorter fuse. In 2012, the authorities suspended expressway tolls for the holiday, hoping to keep traffic flowing, and instead produced gridlock on the first morning across much of the national network, since the toll plazas had been built to meter cars and were now simply admitting them. More than 700 million journeys were made that week. The jams that followed were not a failure of the roads so much as an arithmetic that had never been attempted before. And there is the jam that refused to happen. In July of 2011, Los Angeles closed 10 miles of the 405 through the Sepulveda Pass for 53 hours to take down half of a bridge, and the city spent months warning itself of catastrophe and gave the weekend a name, Carmageddon, before it arrived. What arrived instead was quiet. Northbound volumes approaching the closure fell by around 61% against a normal summer Saturday, and southbound traffic in the San Fernando Valley fell by roughly 73%. The bridge work finished 16 hours early. When the closure was repeated the following year, the same nothing happened again. Told often enough that the roads would be impossible, several million people quietly decided not to use them, which is the only known method of emptying a freeway and remains almost impossible to arrange on purpose. Laid side by side, the field is smaller and vaguer than its reputation. One certified record from a French winter, one border opening that nobody could count, one festival, one flooded evening in Brazil, one snowstorm, one city with a structural shortage of road, one annual migration of a scale that has no comparison, and one apocalypse that politely declined. Against all of it stands the road in Hebei, which did not do anything so dramatic as any of these and simply refused to move for longer. The jam broke apart on the 26th of August, and for a little while it seemed that the story was over. It was not. 10 days later, on the 3rd of September, the same corridor closed again. Reports at the time described roughly 120 kilometers of stopped traffic on the Beijing-Tibet highway between Ordos and Jining, and something in the order of 10,000 coal trucks standing in it. The roadworks that had helped cause the first jam were still going. They had never been scheduled to finish until the middle of September. Drivers who had spent 11 days in the August queue found themselves a fortnight later in the September one. And so the thing we have been describing all this time turns out not really to have been an event at all. It was a symptom that briefly became visible, and then became visible again, and then went back to being ordinary. Because the causes were never accidental, traffic on that road had been growing by something like 40% a year, and by 2010 the volume it carried was reported to be about 60% above the capacity it had been designed for. Inner Mongolia mined and moved 602 million tons of coal in 2009, and in the first half of 2010 alone, its raw coal output reached 338 million tons, nearly 19% up on the year before. The coal went by truck because the railways were full. 4 roads fed into one. There was no villain in it, and no single mistake to point at. There was only a quantity of coal that had outgrown the ways there were of carrying it, and a strip of asphalt in Hebei where that arithmetic finally showed. What fixed it, slowly, was rail. Even while the queue was still sitting there, transport academics were saying so, plainly, that expanding the railways was the only permanent answer, because a train carries more and carries it more cheaply than any number of trucks. And over the following decade, that is broadly what China did. The Zhangjiakou-Tangshan line, a heavy-haul freight railway built for coal, was completed at the end of December 2015. In October 2020, it was merged with 2 older sections into the 1,013-kilometre Tangshan-Baotou route, giving the north of the country a second great coal artery alongside the old Datong-Qinhuangdao line. And in September 2019, the Haoji Railway opened, 1,813 kilometers running from Haole-Baoji in Ordos all the way south to Jian in Jiangxi, crossing 7 provinces, designed to carry 200 million tons of coal a year. It is the longest heavy-haul railway in the world. It exists in part because of queues like the one we have been sitting in. There was a broader shift, too. From around 2018, national policy pushed bulk freight, and coal especially, off the roads and onto the rails. The reason given was air quality at least as much as congestion, but the effect on the roads was the same. Coal that had once climbed into a truck cab in Inner Mongolia and crawled toward Beijing now, increasingly, went into a wagon. And the roads themselves kept being built at a pace that is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. At the end of 2010, around the time of the jam, China's expressway network measured somewhere in the region of 74,000 kilometers. By the end of 2023, it had reached about 184,000, and by 2024, something near 190,000, the longest expressway network in the world, more than twice the length of the American interstate system, and still growing. Somewhere in the middle of that, without any particular ceremony, the corridor northwest of Beijing quietly got wider. The jam, meanwhile, went somewhere else entirely. It went into the internet, where it has stayed ever since, endlessly reposted, and where it has been very gently coming apart. In the retellings, it lasts 9 days, or 11, or 12. It is 60 miles, or 62, or 74.5. It is sometimes said to have stretched 100 kilometers and sometimes 120, which is true of 2 different jams 3 weeks apart, though the retellings rarely mention that there were 2. Every version calls it the worst traffic jam in history, and every version is a little smoother and a little rounder than the one before it, the way a stone in a river is. The version that is closest to the truth is also the least dramatic one: an overloaded road, some roadworks, and a great deal of coal. And the road is still there. It carries more now than it did then, by every measure we have. China had around 207 million registered motor vehicles in 2010. By the end of 2024, it had roughly 453 million, more than twice as many vehicles on the same country. And yet no jam on that corridor has needed the world's attention again in the way that one did. The trucks go up and the trucks come down, and the coal moves, and the road mostly, unremarkably, works. Which is the strangest part of all of it. The most famous traffic jam that has ever happened took place on a road whose ordinary condition now is that nothing happens on it at all. So think for a moment about what was actually there in August of 2010. 100 kilometers of stopped vehicles, which is a length you could see from orbit, arranged in a line so long that a person standing at one end could not have imagined the other end. It commemorated nothing. It was not built. Nobody chose it. Nobody designed it. Nobody was in charge of it. It simply assembled itself out of coal and asphalt and August, stood there for 11 days as one of the largest objects human beings have ever accidentally made, and then took itself apart again and left no mark whatsoever. And inside it, all along, there were people. Men who played cards on the warm bonnets of their trucks. Men who paid 15 yuan for a bottle of water because there was nowhere else to buy one. Men who slept in their cabs with the doors open for the air, and woke and moved a kilometre and slept again. One driver told a reporter that the jams had cut his monthly earnings by 2,000 yuan. That was the shape of it for him, not a world record, just a worse month. They were not doing anything historic. They were at work, and they spent 11 days of their one and only life on a road in Hebei, waiting, and then they drove on and went home, and almost none of their names were ever written down. The world looked at them for about a week. Then it looked away completely and got on with everything else, and the road widened, and the railways opened, and the coal found other ways to travel, and the whole enormous stopped thing became a number that people get slightly wrong on the internet. There is nothing to take from this. No lesson is waiting at the end of it. It is only that 100 kilometers of the world stood still in the summer for 11 days, and then it didn't, and almost everything is like that in the end. The vast majority of what happens simply happens and is absorbed and leaves the road exactly as it found it. So let the trucks be where they are. Let the engines be off and the doors open and the cards laid out on the warm metal. Let the queue stretch away in both directions into the dark, quiet now, and going nowhere, and perfectly content to be going nowhere. It will be gone by morning. It always was. Sleep well. And when you next find yourself wanting to forget, just for an hour, everything that actually matters, the useless hour will be waiting. Good night.